Hey class, today we're going to be learning about the different parts of the respiratory system. What I have right here is I have kind of a blank diagram of a person in anatomical position, and what I'm going to go through and do today is I'm going to go through and label some parts that we need to know and understand. Earlier this week I just introed just the lungs, since those are the main main organs of the respiratory system. But what we're going to look in today is the other parts that help in this process of gas exchange and us taking in oxygen and then breathing out carbon dioxide. So where I'm going to start first is I'm going to actually start with the nasal cavity. And the nasal cavity is going to start here at our nose. So I'm going to draw a little nostril. Now our nostril, or our airway that starts right there, we also call them nares. So nares is a fancy way of talking about nostrils. Now, if you've seen any of the footage of the actual COVID-19 testing, what they do is they stick a really long swab up, and one of them, they'll always ask, what nare do you prefer? So hopefully none of you have to have that tested, but if they ask what nare is better, they're literally asking what nostril and what passageway is better. Now, the nares are separated into right and left. So if I was looking at an upshot of your nose, you have one nare here and you have one nare here, and then it is split in between by the nasal septum. So a lot of you probably know septum. Not only did I have surgery on mine this year because it was severely deviated, but also the big trend right now is to get your septum pierced. So that's just the cartilage piece right in between that splits your nares into right and left. So your nasal cavity starts there, and then basically what it does is it comes up into your nose. And then eventually it actually comes all the way back into your throat. So actually, you probably have heard of an ear, nose, throat doctor. Your ears, your nose, and your throat are all connected together because it helps not only with pressure, but it also helps with drainage. So this is the main part of your nasal cavity. Your nasal cavity is very mucous membrane covered. It is very moist and humid. You actually have a couple things in there called turbinates that help with the humidity and moisture level of your nose. So it's actually really important to keep that well hydrated. Sometimes with allergies, it can get over mucousy. Sometimes it can get too dried out. You just want to make sure that that area stays very moist. What you have inside your nasal cavity, so if we drew the nose a little bit larger, and okay, there's your nostril. If you go inside, you have all these little tiny little hairs inside your nostril, and these are called cilia. Cilia, let me move that over just a little bit. Cilia, there we go. Cilia helps with capturing things from, preventing them from coming in, like dirt and particles, pollen, anything that comes into your nostrils. This helps kind of stop it. It's kind of one of your first lines of defense to try and make sure something's not getting into your airway to block it or cause any problems. Your cilia does go down into your throat and into your trachea as well. It's a little bit different than just the modified hairs in your nose, but you do have these small little cilia projections throughout to hopefully capture anything that's not supposed to be in there. Before I continue down into the airway, I do want to talk about a couple things that are up here. There are ones above your eyebrows. We also have them above our nose, and we also have them in our cheeks. If you have any issues with these, you totally understand. Headaches from these hurt very, very badly. These are your sinuses. So your sinuses basically are these cavities or ducts within your skull that are lined also with the mucous membrane, and they help to warm and moisten the air. You have them in your frontal, your maxillary, your ethmoid, and your sphenoid bones, basically in your face. They help with resonance. So when they say your voice sounds different, when like you finally hear it recorded and then you have it played back, it's because there are sound waves vibrating in your sinuses. If you think you have a sinus infection and you go to the doctors, they literally will tap on your forehead and then tap on your cheeks and ask which one hurts more, just to see whether or not it is a sinus infection up in your frontal or whether it's down in maxillary. But I suffer from sinus headaches, and I will tell you, I don't wish them on anyone because they hurt, just because it's a lot of pressure and then it does affect the way that you breathe. But sinuses, yes, a part of the respiratory system, doesn't actually help with the breathing pathway of how air comes in and then comes down into your lungs, but it does help with that moistening of the air and keeps everything kind of warm as the air comes in as you breathe in. So as we continue in, we start again in the nares or the nostrils and we come into the nasal cavity. As we come down and kind of come into what is basically known as your throat area. So kind of as it descends down into actually what we call as our throat. The fancy way of calling it our throat is we call it our pharynx. I just realized I erased part of his arm. Sorry, little anatomy man, didn't mean to. So we have the pharynx. So this is the fancy way of saying your throat. It's basically a common passageway for food and for air. So when we swallow, eventually food goes one way and air goes the other way. At this point, it's still all coming down in one way. So this is just kind of a common airway for food and air to come in. It's about 5 inches long. But what's really good for us is that when we actually are breathing and when we're swallowing, if you take a second and swallow, you actually stop breathing for a second. And the reason why this happens is there's something called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is basically this little flap. So if this is my airway, it has this little flap. And basically what's going to do is it's going to cover what is our esophagus, where our trachea, and then allow the food to come down into our esophagus. If we don't block our trachea, we basically could have food get into our airway. So basically the epiglottis, when we swallow, shuts it and then blocks off our airway to allow food to get down. But at this point, again, we still have the common pathway in the pharynx. As we come down, we enter into what is known kind of as our voice box area, and this is our larynx. And our larynx is going to, again, just be where our voice box is. So our voice box, if you take your hand and put it kind of on your throat, you can feel where the vibrations of your vocal cords, and you can feel where you kind of have, if you're a male, you have a very predominant Adam's apple. That's about where the larynx is. So it's kind of in this, middle portion of your neck, I guess, is if that's where you want to say it is. Yeah, we'll say that. Middle portion of your neck. That's about where it is. What that then is going to kind of go into is what we call our windpipe or our trachea. So what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start putting lines, because our trachea, and I will write that here in just a second. Here we go. It actually looks like trachea when you write it. But our trachea is this C-shaped cartilage that basically is what connects eventually our nasal cavity and pharynx and larynx all down into our lungs. So you can kind of feel, if you tip your head back kind of at the base of your neck, you can kind of feel this little, it's almost like, I don't know if you guys remember this, there's these tubes and you would swing them around your head and they kind of go woo, 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 woo. It's kind of where it has this little indent. So if you look at it from the side, it has this and it kind of comes in and then comes out, goes in, kind of comes out. So it has this kind of ridged feeling to it almost. That's your trachea and that's your windpipe. This is what actually gets covered when you swallow. So your trachea is where the epiglottis, again, this is my trachea, the epiglottis comes in, covers it up. So when I swallow, food's not getting in there. It's about 4.5 inches long. It's a little flexible, but basically this is also a ciliated mucous membrane. A lot of this is going to have mucous membrane in it because, again, we talked about with the lungs, you don't want any friction and you don't want things to get stuck. So you do have kind of some mucus in there. When we cough, what we're actually trying to do is we're actually trying to get out whatever is stuck in our airway, whether it's mucus, food, something's in there. That's actually what a cough is you're trying to get something out of your lungs or your airway. So when we are going to the trachea eventually is going to divide into 2 sides. So we have it going one way over here, and then we have it going one way over here. Now, if you can figure it out, dun, 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 we have 2 lungs. So we have to have basically 2 branching airways that come from the main one that then branch off to the 2 sides. These are going to be known as our bronchi. So if you ever get bronchitis, you actually have inflammation of these airways. So bronchi are just the trachea being divided into 2 passageways, into a right and a left. It still is a ciliated mucous membrane that has this nice little cartilage to it. So it's very similar to the trachea. It's just where it kind of divides. Now, this then is broken into even smaller branches. And I kind of always think It almost reminds me of like broccoli. So like if you have broccoli and you've got the little tufty tops at the top and then you've got the little branches and it comes down to the little stalk, that's almost what I think of when I think of bronchi, and then these little things are called bronchioles. So bronchioles just mean a smaller version of the bronchi. So basically what it is we have larger splitting of the airways, and then it splits into even smaller airways from there. And at this point, we actually are inside the lungs at this point. So the bronchi come down and then divide into bronchioles. And I apologize, these are not, if your lungs look like this, we have some problems. So, yeah, so don't worry, this is not what it should look like, but this is what it looks like for us. So basically, you have these little bronchioles branching off, and again, they're made of the same mucus ciliated membrane that basically has this little cartilage in it. But what happens is once we're inside the lungs, we end up having these little, basically air sacs is what we're going to call them, at the ends of the bronchioles. Now these are filled throughout the entire lung, so don't think it just stops in this like little area. No, it goes throughout the entire lung. It's just for our intents and purpose right now, this is kind of what they're going to look like. But basically what these are, and every year somebody calls them ravioli, so if you think of ravioli to help you remember them, awesome, it always helps. These are called alveoli. And alveoli are just that. They're just these little tiny little air sacs that basically, this is where we have our oxygen and our carbon dioxide exchange. So these are really important. They tend to have a lot of blood vessels around them because that's, again, where we have the gas exchange. So alveoli are very important in the gas exchange because it's really where it happens. And so basically inside each lung, you have all these little tiny little air sacs that fill up with the air that we breathe in and then breathe out, and then have all these little blood vessels that are kind of wrapped around them in order for us to have this gas exchange. One thing that really, really is important in alveoli is something called surfactant. Again, I can't emphasize enough that when we talk about the respiratory system, it's all about keeping, and again, most of you probably don't like this word, it's about keeping things moist. There's actually quite a bit of moisture and fluid and liquid surrounding the lungs as well as within the lungs to make sure that things aren't sticking. So surfactant is basically a special little liquid that helps keep alveoli from collapsing. I think of it as almost like taking a balloon, when you blow it up, it kind of spreads the walls of the balloon so they're not sticking. If you took all the air out because you put a little moisture in there, they kind of tend to stick. Surfactant helps to keep that kind of like inflated and basically keep them from like sticking together and not being able to be pulled apart. So all of this is very, very important. And again, we start this whole process up at our nares or our nostrils. We come into the nasal cavity, we come down to the pharynx, we come down into the larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and then we come into the alveoli. Now, I will be talking more about how we actually breathe next week, but this is just the general overview of the different parts of the respiratory system. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, but that's it for today on the parts of the respiratory system.